The morning Hattie Boone arrived in Creston Flats, the town looked like it had given up on itself. She came in on the 9 o'clock freight wagon, sitting in the back beside a crate of lamp oil and a flour sack she'd tied shut with her own belt. Everything else she'd owned was back in Laramie. The house, the furniture, the 8 years she'd spent building a life with a man who turned out to be building a different one at the same time. She hadn't cried on the way out. She'd just locked the front door, left the key on the kitchen table, and walked to the freight office with her one bag. Creston Flats was the end of the line, practically speaking. It sat at the base of the Harrow Mountains in southeastern Colorado, the kind of place that existed because ore had once come out of the ground in useful quantities. The ore had slowed. The men who worked the mine still came into town on Fridays, but there were fewer of them every season, and the town had begun to have the look of something waiting to find out whether it would survive or not. The wagon stopped in front of a building with a sign that said Boone General in Barrett's, in faded paint. Hattie climbed down without help and stood in the dirt street, looking up at it. Her father's name, her grandfather's name before that. Her Uncle Court had been running the store for 11 years while she was in Laramie, and he'd written to her 3 months ago saying he was sick, and the store was struggling, and he didn't know what else to do but ask. She pushed open the door. Court Boone was behind the counter, thinner than she remembered, with the yellowish look of a man whose liver was doing him no favors. He brightened when he saw her, genuinely and immediately, the way old people do when they've been alone too long. "Hattie," he said. "Court," she said. She set her bag down on the floor and looked around the store. Shelves half empty, dust on the glass cases, a mousetrap in the corner that hadn't been emptied, the account ledger lying open on the counter with a column of numbers that didn't need explanation. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough that I wrote to you," he said. She picked up the ledger and read it the way she read everything, quietly, without expression, taking in what was there. The store was behind on its supplier account. 3 regular customers had left town in the past year. The mine company had started running its own commissary up at the camp, which had taken the bulk trade away. What was left was walk-in business from the families in town, and it wasn't enough. "You should have written sooner," she said. "Probably," he said. She closed the ledger and put it back on the counter. "I'll sleep in the back room," she said. "We'll go through the inventory tomorrow morning." Court started to say something, some form of thank you, she could tell, and she shook her head slightly. She wasn't there for thanks. She was there because the store had her family's name on it, and she had nowhere else to be, and sometimes those 2 things were enough to get a person moving. The inventory took 2 days. What she found was not as bad as the ledger had suggested in some ways and worse in others. The stock was old but mostly sound. The pricing was off. Court had been undercutting himself for years, afraid of losing customers, which had only meant he lost money on every sale. The supplier relationship was salvageable if she paid something against the account before the end of the month. The building itself was solid, which mattered more than people thought. What the store didn't have was a reason for people to come in. That was the problem she kept coming back to as she worked through those first weeks. The mine commissary had the bulk goods. The town's other remaining shop, a small hardware outfit run by a man named Declan Ord, had the tools and fittings. Boone General Goods had been trying to compete in the middle of both, and losing. She stood in the store one afternoon after Court had gone to rest, looking at the space, and tried to think about what the town actually needed that it didn't have. The answer came to her while she was watching a woman named Sadie Pruitt walk past the window with 2 children and a basket on her arm. The woman was headed to the end of the street, where a bakery had operated for about 6 months before the baker's husband got a job offer in Denver, and the whole family left. That was 14 months ago. Since then, if you wanted bread in Creston Flats, you baked it yourself, or you went without. Hattie had been baking her own bread since she was 9 years old. Her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that, a style of rye bread with a thick crust and a heavy, close crumb that kept for days without going stale. It was the bread her family had brought west from Pennsylvania, and she had baked it in Laramie every week for 8 years. So automatically that she'd never thought of it as a skill. She thought about it now. She started the next Saturday. She didn't announce it or put up a sign. She simply used the cast-iron stove in the back room, the one that had been used for warmth, not cooking, and baked 6 loaves using the flour already in stock. She put them on the counter at 7 in the morning and waited. The smell did the announcing for her. In a town where nobody had smelled fresh bread in over a year, the odor coming out of Boone General Goods that morning was not a subtle thing. By 8 o'clock, Sadie Pruitt was inside buying a loaf. By 9, a man named Fletcher Coyle had come in for 2, one of which he admitted he was going to eat before he got home. By 10:30, the counter was empty. Court stood in the doorway to the back room watching her bag up the last loaf. "How much did we make?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's more than we made all of last Tuesday," he said. "I know," she said. "I looked at the books." She ordered more flour the following week, and more again the week after. By the end of the month, she was baking every day but Sunday, and she'd added 2 other things. A simple butter cake that she made on Thursdays, and a jar of the sourdough starter she'd been keeping since her mother gave it to her, which she offered to sell in small crocks to women who wanted to bake their own. That last part was Court's idea, actually. He'd watched a woman named Margot Fenn linger by the starter jar for 5 minutes one morning, clearly wanting to ask about it. "Tell her about it," he'd said to Hattie quietly, from behind the counter. "I wasn't going to not tell her," Hattie said. "I mean, tell her about your mother's starter, the story of it." Hattie looked at him. "People like to know where a thing comes from," he said. "Makes it feel like something." She thought about that for a moment, then walked over to where Margot Fenn was standing and told her the whole history. The starter that her grandmother had kept through 3 winters in a sod house, that her mother had carried west in a clay crock wrapped in a wool sock, that Hattie had fed every week for 8 years in Laramie. She told her what it took to keep it alive and what it produced when you did. Margot Fenn bought a crock of starter, a bag of rye flour, and 2 loaves of bread. She came back the following Thursday with questions about why her first attempt had gone flat, and Hattie talked her through it. She came back the Thursday after that to show Hattie a loaf she'd baked that had worked, and there was something in her face when she set it on the counter that was not about bread at all. By October, the store was covering its supplier account. By November, it was doing better than that. But things in Creston Flats had a habit of not staying simple. The mine company's name was Harrow Mountain Extraction, and the man who ran its local interests was a territorial agent named Silas Pruitt. Hattie caught herself and set the thought aside. The man's name was Boyd Kenner. He had an office above the freight station and a habit of appearing in doorways at inconvenient moments, as he did one Thursday afternoon when Hattie was in the middle of explaining bread hydration to 4 women crowded around the counter. Kenner was a compact man in his 40s, well-dressed for Creston Flats, with a way of looking at a room that suggested he was always assessing the value of everything in it. "Miss Boone," he said. "Mr. Kenner," she said. He waited until the women had bought their things and left before he came to the counter. He had a document with him, folded in thirds, which he placed on the counter and smoothed with his palm. "Company's expanding the commissary," he said. "We're bringing in a full dry goods operation. Should be running by spring." She looked at the document. It was a notice of expanded services, signed by 3 men in Denver she'd never heard of. "We thought it was only fair to let the existing merchants know," he said. "Give you time to make arrangements." "What kind of arrangements did you have in mind?" she said. "The company might consider purchasing remaining inventory at a fair rate," he said. "Save you the difficulty of winding things down yourself." She looked at him for a moment without speaking. "This building," she said, "has been a general store since 1871. It has my family's name on it." "I understand that," he said, in the tone of a man who understood it perfectly and considered it irrelevant. "Thank you for the notice," she said, and slid the document back across the counter toward him. He left it there. "Think it over," he said. "Offer won't stay open past January." After he left, Court came out from the back room, where he'd been resting. He'd heard the whole thing. "Hattie," he said. "I know," she said. "We can't compete with the company if they bring in a full dry goods operation." "I know that too," she said. She stood at the counter for a while, after he went back to lie down. She looked at the starter jar, at the flour sacks behind the counter, at the shelf where she'd begun stocking the sourdough crocks. She thought about what Margot Fenn's face had looked like when she'd put that loaf on the counter. Then she started thinking practically, which was what she did when she couldn't afford to do anything else. The thing she understood about Boone General Goods that Boyd Kenner did not was that it wasn't really a store anymore. It had stopped being a store sometime around the third week of October and had become something else. Something harder to name and, she suspected, harder to displace with a company commissary that sold bulk flour and dried beans by the pound. People didn't come in just to buy things. They came in because Margot Fenn had told someone about the starter, and that person had told someone else. They came in because Fletcher Coyle had mentioned to the men at the mine that the bread at Boone's was the best thing he'd eaten since his wife's cooking, and his wife had been dead for 2 years. They came in because the 4 women who'd started gathering on Thursday mornings had started calling it something, not a class, nothing as formal as that, just a Thursday thing, a reason to be somewhere warm with other people and talk about something that wasn't hardship. She thought about all of this, and then she went to see Declan Ord. Ord was a quiet man, mid-50s, who had been running the hardware shop for 9 years and had no more interest in being bought out by Harrow Mountain Extraction than she did. He listened to what she told him about Kenner's visit without interrupting. "He came to see me last month," Ord said when she was done. "Different offer, same idea. What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it," he said, "which I haven't." She nodded. "I think if we're going to be here in 2 years," she said, "we need to give people a reason to come into town instead of just going up to the company store." "The company store's at the camp," Ord said. "That's 2 miles uphill." 2 miles isn't that far when you're already there," she said. "We need to make it worth coming down." They talked for an hour. It was not the kind of conversation that produced a plan so much as a general direction, that the 2 remaining independent businesses in Creston Flats needed to stop operating as if they were the last ones standing, and start acting like the center of something. Hattie walked home in the cold and thought about what that center might look like. She'd noticed the empty building next to the store in her first week. It had been a small restaurant once, or something like one. There was a rusted stovepipe still attached to the back wall and a wooden counter built into one side. The man who'd owned it had left 2 years ago when his lease ran out, and he decided there wasn't enough business to renew it. She spoke to the building's owner, a woman named Pearl Cassidy, who lived 3 streets over and had been renting the space for storage since the restaurant closed. Pearl was in her 60s, practical, and not particularly attached to the arrangement. "I'd want a proper rent," Pearl said. "I'd want a proper lease," Hattie said. They settled the terms in an afternoon. What she was thinking, and she was careful when she explained it to Court, not to make it sound larger than it was not a restaurant. She didn't have the staff or the capital for a restaurant. What she was thinking was simpler. A room where the bread got baked, where people could sit with a cup of coffee and a slice of something warm, and where the Thursday gatherings could happen without crowding out the actual store. "A bakehouse," Court said. "Something like that," she said. "We don't have money to set that up," he said. "No," she said, "not yet." She was quiet for a moment. "But I've been thinking about the women who come on Thursdays," she said. "Margot Fenn, the Pruitt woman. Ida Holloway. There are 7 of them now. They know this town better than I do. They know what's needed and what isn't." "You want to ask them," Court said. "I want to talk to them," she said. "There's a difference." The Thursday before Thanksgiving, instead of the usual bread demonstration, Hattie made coffee and set out chairs and told the 7 women who came in that she had something she wanted to discuss. She explained what she'd learned from the ledger and what Kenner had told her and what she'd agreed to with Pearl Cassidy. She told them what she was trying to build and what she didn't have. Ida Holloway, who was 61 and had buried a husband and 2 sons, and was not a woman who wasted time on sentiment, said, "What do you need from us?" "Honest answers," Hattie said. "First, if there were a place to sit in the morning and have something warm, would you use it? Would the people you know use it?" The answer was yes, stated in 7 different ways. "Second," she said, "the stove in that building next door needs relining before it's safe to use. I don't have the money for that right now. Does anyone know a mason?" Margot Fenn's husband turned out to be a man who'd worked with stone for 20 years. He came the following Saturday, looked at the stove situation, and told Hattie what it would cost. It was not as much as she'd feared. Fletcher Coyle, who had heard from Margot's husband about what was happening, showed up that same afternoon with 2 men from the mine who were carpenters in their off hours. They looked at the wooden counter and the rotten section of floor near the door and said they could fix it in a weekend. Hattie did not ask them. They came on their own. That was the part she thought about later, when she was trying to understand what had happened. She paid the mason and paid for materials. She could not pay the carpenters. She told them that directly, but she could feed them, and she did. And on the Sunday evening when they finished, she put a full meal on the wooden counter they'd just repaired, and everyone stood around it and ate. It was the first time since she'd arrived in Creston Flats that she'd seen people in the same room enjoying themselves, without it being in service of something urgent. The bakehouse opened the first week of December, which was perhaps not the most auspicious timing in terms of foot traffic, but had the advantage that the smell of a warm building and fresh bread carried a very long way on cold air. She didn't call it a bakehouse publicly. She didn't call it anything. She put a small chalkboard in the window with that day's bread and whatever else she had, and she opened the door at 7 in the morning, and she let it be what it was. By the second week, it was full most mornings by 8. It wasn't just women. That surprised her somewhat. She'd expected the Thursday crowd to expand, but hadn't fully anticipated that men would come in too, the ones who lived alone or boarded somewhere without a kitchen, who hadn't had anything home-baked since they could remember. Fletcher Coyle came every morning. Declan Ord started coming on Tuesdays and Fridays. A young man named Pete Harlan, who worked at the freight station and couldn't cook anything beyond boiled eggs, became a daily regular, and eventually started helping stack chairs and sweep up in exchange for his breakfast, not because Hattie asked, but because he seemed to need something to do with himself. The Thursdays continued in the back room of the store, which was now less crowded. The group had grown to 11 women, and they had moved beyond bread. Ida Holloway had started teaching the younger ones to put up preserves. Margot Fenn had offered to show anyone who was interested how her grandmother's method for making soap worked. Someone had asked Hattie if she could teach a Saturday session for older children, something to keep them occupied and give them a useful skill, and she'd said yes before she'd thought about whether she had time. Court watched all of this from his chair behind the store counter, with the expression of a man who had been right about something, but was too tired to say so. "You should take a rest sometime," he said to her one evening. "I'll rest when the January deadline passes," she said. He was quiet. "He's not going to let it go," he said. "Kenner, the company's serious about the expansion." "I know," she said. "Buying out the supplier account won't be enough," he said. "They want to be the only game in town." She knew that, too. She'd been thinking about it since October, and she'd arrived at a conclusion that she hadn't quite put into words yet, even to herself. What the company could not buy was what was already built. Not the building. Buildings could be sold and leased and traded. What could not be transferred was the fact that 11 women met in the back of Boone General Goods every Thursday, and that the men who'd fixed the bakehouse floor came in for bread every week, and that Pete Harlan swept up every morning, and that Ida Holloway had told her last Tuesday, with the directness of a woman who did not bother with indirection, that the bakehouse was the best thing that had happened to Creston Flats since the mine first opened, and maybe better. You could not move that to a commissary 2 miles up the mountain. Kenner came back in the second week of January, as he'd said he would. The bakehouse was open. The store was busy. Hattie was behind the counter of the store when he walked in, and she finished what she was doing, counting change for a woman buying flour, before she acknowledged him. "Miss Boone," he said. "Mr. Kenner," she said. "The offer's closing at the end of the week," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not taking it." He looked around the store. He looked at the connecting door to the bakehouse, which was standing open, and at the sound of voices and the smell of coffee coming through it. "The company's moving forward with the expansion regardless," he said. "You understand that." "I do," she said. "This becomes harder for you once that's in place," he said. She looked at him. "I want to show you something," she said. She came around the counter and walked to the bakehouse door. He followed, not quite willingly. She didn't go in. She just stood in the doorway so he could see past her. The room was full. Every table occupied, Pete Harlan moving between them with the coffee pot. Margot Fenn, in the corner, talking to 2 women Hattie hadn't seen in the store before, who had apparently come in from one of the farms east of town. "There are 14 families who've started buying their dry goods from us again in the past 6 weeks," she said, not turning around. "Some of them had been going up to the commissary. They came back because of this." She meant the room, the coffee, the fact of people being together and comfortable. "The company can build whatever it wants up at the camp," she said. But you cannot put this in a commissary. Kenner stood in the doorway for a moment. She could not tell what he was thinking and did not particularly try. That's your final answer, he said. It is, she said. He left without taking the document from the counter. She found it there after he'd gone and put it in the stove. The expansion did go forward. By March, the company had added a full dry goods section to the mine commissary, which had the predictable effect of pulling some of the bulk business back uphill. Hattie had anticipated this and had spent December and January focusing on what couldn't be replicated: specialty flours, the sourdough crocks, things that required relationship and knowledge rather than just supply. What she had not anticipated, and this she admitted only to Court in the quiet of the back room one evening, was how much the bakehouse would change the store itself. People came in for bread and stayed to buy things. They came in to pick up their starter crocks and mentioned something they needed. The cross-traffic was not planned. It happened the way things happen when you give people a reason to be somewhere. By spring, the store's numbers were better than they'd been in 4 years. Court said so one evening, looking at the ledger. Better than when I was healthy, he said. There was something in his voice that was not quite self-reproach. You built the relationships, she said. I just used them. He shook his head. I kept the doors open, he said. That's different. She didn't argue with him. She knew he needed to believe there was a distinction, and she thought he was probably right anyway. The fact that people in Creston Flats still remembered Boone General Goods fondly still came in out of habit, even when habit hadn't been enough to keep the business solvent, was something Court had tended for 11 years. She had simply given it somewhere to go. In April, Margot Fenn's husband finished building a proper outdoor stone oven behind the bakehouse. The kind his grandfather had built in the old country, he said, with walls thick enough to hold heat for 6 hours. He built it without being asked, on his own time, using stone he'd sourced himself. When he was finished, he showed Hattie how to fire it and explained the way the heat distributed through the chamber. She baked the first loaves in it on a Saturday morning in late April, with the door propped open to the spring air. Half the Thursday group had come to watch. Fletcher Coyle was there. Pete Harlan was there. Declan Ord had closed the hardware shop for the morning. The bread that came out of that stone oven was different. Better in a way she found difficult to explain, but everyone who tasted it agreed on. The crust had a quality that the cast iron stove had never produced. It was the kind of thing that made people go quiet for a moment when they bit into it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Someone said they should have a proper event of some kind. A celebration. Spring was as good a reason as any. She thought about this for a moment. Saturday after next, she said. We'll bake everything we have. Anyone who wants to come, comes. It was not a festival. It was a Saturday in April in a small Colorado town, with tables set up in front of the bakehouse, and the stone oven going, and bread and butter cake, and whatever else people brought, which turned out to be quite a lot. Ida Holloway brought preserves. Someone brought a fiddle. Declan Ord brought his wife, whom Hattie had never met, a small, sharp woman named Grace, who took one look at the Thursday group and said she'd been wanting to learn to put up preserves for years. By noon, the street in front of the bakehouse was full of people. Hattie stood in the bakehouse doorway for a while, watching. Court was sitting in a chair someone had brought out for him, a cup of coffee in his hand, talking to Fletcher Coyle. Pete Harlan was cutting bread. Margot Fenn's husband was explaining the stone oven to 3 men who were clearly already thinking about building one somewhere. What she felt, standing there, was not triumph exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than that. She had come to Creston Flats with one bag and nothing particular ahead of her, and she had made something. Not out of nothing. Never out of nothing. There had been Court's 11 years of kept open doors, and Margot Fenn's genuine curiosity, and Fletcher Coyle's honest hunger, and Pete Harlan's need to be useful. There had been her grandmother's starter, alive in its crock, fed every week for 3 generations. There had been stone and wood and flour, and the specific quality of mountain air in a cold morning. You did not make something out of nothing. You found what was already there, and you gave it a shape. She went back inside to cut more bread. The door stayed open all afternoon, and people came in and out of it for hours, and the name on the building at the end of the day was the same name it had always been.